The morning I was fired, the CEO thanked me for my loyalty before handing my job to his son. What made the moment almost funny was that his son had never even logged into the system he was being hired to manage. I had spent 4 years building that system from scratch, fixing its failures after midnight, and quietly turning a chaotic operation into the most profitable division in the company. They thought they were replacing an employee. They had no idea they were removing the person who understood why everything worked. My name is Claire Morgan, and until that morning, I was the Director of Operations Technology at Meridian Supply Group, a mid-sized logistics company headquartered outside Chicago. I was 36, single, and probably far too comfortable being the person everyone called when something went wrong. I knew which warehouses were always late with inventory reports, which managers needed 3 reminders before approving a shipment, and which tiny software error could turn a normal Tuesday into a $1 million problem. The system I managed was called Atlas. Officially, Atlas was a company-wide logistics platform that connected warehouse inventory, purchasing, transportation, customer orders, and financial reporting. Unofficially, it was the reason Meridian had stopped losing money through operational mistakes. I had not inherited Atlas. I had built most of it. When I joined Meridian, the company was still using 6 different software programs that barely communicated with each other. Warehouse employees entered the same information 3 times. Purchasing teams relied on spreadsheets. Drivers received outdated instructions. Managers spent hours every week trying to figure out where missing inventory had gone. I proposed a unified system. During my 2nd month, my boss at the time told me it was too ambitious, so I built a small prototype on weekends. Then I built another. 6 months later, the company approved the project. I worked with a tiny team, often staying late after everyone else had gone home. We tested the system in 1 warehouse, then 3, then 12. When Atlas finally went company-wide, order accuracy increased, inventory waste dropped, and management suddenly had information they could actually trust. The CEO, Richard Caldwell, loved the results. He loved them enough to put my picture in the annual report, but he never seemed particularly interested in how the system worked. That became important. Later, Richard was the kind of executive who remembered revenue numbers but forgot employees' names. He was charming when cameras were present, demanding when they were not, and obsessed with the appearance of control. For years, I stayed out of office politics. I believed that if I kept producing results, my work would speak for itself. That was my first mistake. My second was believing that everyone else valued results as much as I did. The trouble began when Richard announced that his son, Evan Caldwell, would be joining the company. Evan was 28 and had spent the previous few years working at a consulting firm in New York. At least, that was what his resume said. His arrival was treated like a corporate holiday. Executives gathered in the conference room. People brought coffee and pastries. Richard gave a speech about the next generation of leadership. Evan walked in wearing an expensive suit, smiled confidently, and shook hands with everyone. When he reached me, Richard introduced me as the person responsible for Atlas. Evan nodded, then he asked, "What exactly does Atlas do?" I thought he was joking. He was not. I explained the basics. He listened for about 30 seconds before saying, "Sounds complicated." I smiled politely and said, "It is, but once you understand the architecture, the logic is fairly straightforward." He laughed. I remember that laugh because it told me something I did not understand until much later. Evan did not want to understand Atlas. He wanted to own it. Over the next few months, Richard began bringing Evan into executive meetings. At first, Evan simply observed. Then he started making suggestions. Some were reasonable, others were dangerous. He wanted to remove certain approval controls because they slowed down orders. He wanted managers to have broader access to financial data. He wanted automated alerts turned off because executives complained about receiving too many notifications. I explained why those controls existed. Evan would nod, but he rarely listened. Eventually, Richard started agreeing with him. The first time I realized my position was in danger was during a quarterly strategy meeting. Evan presented a slide showing that Atlas could be made more efficient by reducing operational oversight. Looked at the slide and immediately noticed 3 assumptions that were wrong. Waited until he finished. Then I said, if we remove those controls, the system will approve duplicate purchase orders under certain conditions. Evan looked irritated. He said, "We tested it." I asked, "Which environment?" He hesitated. Production? He finally answered. I knew that was impossible because I controlled production access. I looked at Richard. Richard looked at me. Then he said, Claire, perhaps you should be more supportive of Evan. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was unfair, because it was a warning. After that meeting, Evan became increasingly involved in my department. He started scheduling meetings without me. He asked my employees for reports directly. He presented Atlas improvements to senior management as if they were his ideas. I tried to ignore it. Then one afternoon, my senior engineer, Marcus Lee, came into my office and closed the door. He said, Claire, are they trying to push you out? I asked why he thought that. He told me Evan had asked him what would happen if I were no longer responsible for Atlas. Felt something cold settle in my stomach. I asked what Marcus had said. He told Evan that replacing me would be difficult because I had designed the system, architecture, and documented several legacy processes that were not obvious from the code. I thanked him and told him not to discuss the conversation with anyone. That evening, I stayed late. I opened Atlas and reviewed the access logs. Nothing looked unusual. Then, I checked the administrative changes. Someone had requested elevated permissions for Evan. I rejected the request. The next morning, Richard called me into his office. He was standing near the window. Evan was sitting in one of the chairs. Richard told me the company was restructuring the technology division. I knew immediately. He said my current position was being eliminated. I asked who would take over Atlas. Richard looked toward his son. Evan smiled. Remember staring at them for several seconds? Then I asked, so you are giving my position to Evan? Richard corrected me. He said the company was creating a new executive role for Evan, but the responsibilities were mine. The employees were mine. The system was mine, and the salary was substantially higher. I asked whether my performance had been an issue. Richard said no. I asked whether Atlas had failed. He said absolutely not. I asked whether there was any business reason for removing me. He paused. Then he said, Claire, companies have to think about succession. That was the explanation. Succession. I had spent 4 years building something the company could not operate without, and apparently that made me replaceable. Richard handed me a severance agreement. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not threaten anyone. I simply asked one question. When is my access being terminated? Richard said immediately. I nodded. Then I handed him my company laptop. Before leaving, I looked at Evan. I said, you should read the operational documentation before making changes. He smiled. I hope you will not have to worry about that anymore. I walked out. But there was one thing neither of them knew. Atlas was not just software. It was an ecosystem. And although the company owned the platform, I had spent years creating something much more important. Knowledge. Knew every critical dependency. I knew which automated processes relied on outdated vendor data. I knew which integrations could fail. Silently, I knew where the emergency recovery procedures were stored, and I knew something Evan had never bothered to learn. Atlas had been built around a set of operational safeguards that only worked because they were maintained manually. Not because the system was badly designed, because Meridian had refused to spend money, replacing several old systems. I had warned them about this repeatedly. They ignored me. Now they had handed the entire operation to someone who did not know those warnings existed. For the first week after my departure, I tried to move on. I updated my resume. I spoke with recruiters. I went to interviews. I told myself Meridian was no longer my problem. Then, 9 days after I was fired, Marcus called me. He sounded exhausted. He said, Claire, Atlas is having problems. I asked what kind. He told me shipments were being released without one of the required confirmations. I asked whether Evan had changed the approval rules. Marcus said yes. Closed my eyes. I told him I was sorry, but I could not help because I no longer worked there. He understood. Then, he said something that made me sit up. There was a second issue. The company had discovered discrepancies between warehouse, inventory, and customer orders. I knew exactly what that meant. Told Marcus to check the synchronization. He did. A few minutes later, he called back. He said, you were right. The The queue was backing up because Evan had disabled a validation process. I told him to restore it. He said Evan had restricted his access. That was when I realized this was no longer simply about my old job. Meridian was heading toward a serious operational failure. Still did not intervene. Not immediately. 3 days later, I received an email from Richard. He wanted to meet. I almost deleted it. Instead, I accepted. When I walked into his office, he looked different. Less confident, more tired. Evan was not there. Richard asked me how much I knew about the recent problems. Told him I knew enough. He asked whether I could fix them. I said yes. Then, I asked why I should. He stared at me. I told him, "You did not fire me because I failed. You fired me because you wanted your son in my position." Richard looked down. I continued, "I am not coming back to sit underneath Evan and clean up mistakes while he takes credit for the results." He asked what I wanted. That question surprised me. For years, I had accepted whatever responsibility they gave me without negotiating what it was worth. This time, I was ready. I told him I wanted an independent consulting agreement. I wanted authority. Over the technical recovery, I wanted direct reporting to the board committee, overseeing operations, and I wanted a formal audit of every major change Evan had made to Atlas since taking control. Richard asked whether I was threatening him. I said, "No, I am giving you a choice." He was silent for a long time, then he agreed. The next morning, I returned to Meridian as a consultant. The office felt strangely familiar. People greeted me quietly. Marcus looked relieved. Evan looked furious. He cornered me near the conference room and asked what I was doing there. I told him I had been hired to stabilize Atlas. He said, "I am responsible for Atlas now." I looked at him. Then I said, "Then you should have no problem showing me what you changed." He had no answer. The audit took 2 weeks. We found 17 major configuration changes, 5. Created unnecessary operational risk, 3. Had caused actual financial losses, had disabled a safeguard that prevented duplicate purchasing, and the most serious problem was hidden insider reporting. Integration Evan had modified without understanding the underlying data structure. The numbers executives had been using for 2 months were wrong. Not dramatically. Wrong. Dangerously wrong. Inventory looked healthier than it actually was. Profit margins appeared stronger. Several contracts that management thought were performing well were losing money. The board was furious, but I was not interested in revenge. I wanted accountability. The audit report documented every change, who approved it, what it affected, and what the consequences were. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no public humiliation. The evidence did not need emotion. It spoke for itself. Evan was removed from operational control. Richard remained CEO, but the board appointed an independent oversight committee. As for me, I received an offer to return as Chief Technology and Operations Officer. I turned it down. Instead, I negotiated a separate contract to complete the recovery and transition Atlas to a new leadership team. Then, I did something I had never done before. I left. 6 months later, I started my own operations technology company. Marcus joined me. 2 other engineers followed. Our first major client was a logistics company that wanted to modernize its operations. Almost laughed when I signed the contract. For years, I had believed my value came from the position I held. I finally understood that my value had never been the title. It was the knowledge, discipline, and judgment I had built along the way. About a year after I left Meridian, I received an invitation to a business conference. Richard was speaking there. So was I. Backstage, we passed each other. He stopped. He said, "Claire, I owe you an apology." I told him he did. He nodded. Then he said, "I thought I was preparing my company for the future." I answered, "You were preparing your son for a position. Those are not the same thing." He did not argue. When I walked onto the stage, the room was filled with executives, founders, investors, and technology leaders. My presentation was about something I had learned the hard way. Companies often believe systems are what make businesses work. They are. Not systems only work when people understand them and when leadership confuses ownership with understanding. Eventually, the difference becomes expensive. I never got my old job back. I did not want it. Losing that position had been painful, humiliating, and terrifying, but it forced me to recognize something I had ignored for years. I had spent so much time proving that I was valuable to someone else that I had forgotten to build. Something valuable for myself. Meridian had given my job to the CEO's son. They thought they were taking away my future. Instead, they accidentally gave me the reason to build one.